Let's talk about V.E. Schwab. Take two. I have already filmed this video once, and if you watched my video from last week, when I filmed this video the first time, had a bit of pregnancy depression, and I don't feel like I did it justice. V.E. Schwab is one of my favorite authors, and I wanted to refilm this and give it the oomph that it deserves because she's a fantastic author. And for anyone who has either read her before and isn't sure where to go from here, or hasn't even jumped into her books yet, I'm hoping to build this guide as like a reader's point of view of maybe where another reader should start. For background, I have been reading V.E. Schwab for years and years and years. I've read all of her releases minus the graphic novels, so disclaimer on that. However, she has a couple of new books coming out this year, and I'm really excited. And in honor of the books coming out this year, I would like to give my reader point of view of where maybe you want to start. So I have split this video into 3 different sections, and I will kind of break that down in just a second. But as an overview of how V.E. Schwab writes, I would say that she is really lyrical in her prose. She actually comes from a poetic background. I think from that, she's written a lot of stories where she places importance on the cadence of every single sentence, and you can tell. Along with that, her stories are very character driven. So if you are not as into stories that are lyrical and character driven, she might not be the best fit for you. But if it's something that does interest you, I wanted to go ahead and give this guide as a starting point because all of her books are different and all of her books will speak to a different type of reader, unless you are like me and you just like a really good story. As a disclaimer, before we jump into the sections, I am outside. My daughter's playing, my dogs are out here, and there's people doing a little bit of road work, so I'm hoping that the sound on this comes out okay so that I don't have to refilm it a third time. But so that would be my quick disclaimer on any background noises that you might find. I'm going to try and edit them as best I can, but it is what it is. Let's jump into the different types of categories that I've kind of separated these into. The first one that we're going to jump into is books of hers that have like a Gothic or a haunted theme. And then the second one is people who enjoy books that have more of a morally gray type of character, story, anti-hero, villains even. That would be the second theme. And then the third one is more fantasy driven. And within these sections, there are a couple of stories that fit also a fourth undefined section, which is more of an introspective section. It's not really a theme, but that's like more of the vibe you get from the story. So let's go ahead and jump into the haunted and Gothic type of stories. So to start out this haunted Gothic section of the video, we are going to jump into the book series that I have right next to me. And that one is City of Ghosts. And so this book is about a girl who in the past has died and she came back. And from that experience, she has the ability to step through the veil. And so at the start of this book, her parents are starting a ghost hunting show. They're ghost hunters, and they bring her to Scotland. And so when in Scotland, she's in one of the most haunted places in the world, and she recognizes that something might be haunting her back, and that's when the danger begins. And so this is a 3-book series. The second one is set in France in the catacombs, and that one is Tunnel of Bones. And the third one that she has in this series is set in New Orleans, and that one is Bridge of Souls. And they're all very atmospheric, very spooky, very fall vibes, but I would say I recommend them at any point of the year just because they're such great stories and her characters go through so much, but you love her characters. She really works hard to build her characters. And so that would be the first thing that I recommend for anyone who is looking for something that is Gothic or ghostly or haunted. This is really the direct recommendation of that because it involves ghosts and a girl who sees ghosts, talks to ghosts, steps through the veil, all the things. Next under this section, I would say maybe for someone looking for a little bit more of an adult theme story. There are not adult elements in this story, but the atmosphere is a little heavier. And so for that, I would say you should probably start with Gallant. And this is still kind of like ghost story-esque in the sense that this is about a girl who is in a school for girls whose mom died when she was young. She's never known her father, and she has a journal from her mom. One day she gets a letter telling her to return to Gallant, the house where her mom grew up, and she wants to know more about it, even though her journal explicitly says, like, do not go back to this place. And so she does, and she discovers all these beautiful spaces within the house, but there are also shadows, and there are some weird things going on. And I think it's her cousin has strange dreams. Outside of the house is this beautiful garden with roses that have a bunch of thorns. And outside of the garden is a crumbling wall with an iron door that she just can't figure out how to open. And when she does, things get flipped kind of sideways. And so this one is more of a spooky atmosphere where you don't know what's going on until the end. It's haunted in the sense that there are shadow figures and creepy things, but it's more of a parallel, like, shadow world type of story than the City of Ghosts, wherein you're actually speaking about like the afterlife. This is more of a spooky, atmospheric, unknown type of vibe. So that one is Gallant. This is a standalone, by the way. So this is the only story. It's not too long, very, very well written in the sense that you kind of like are itching to know what in the world is going on. Next in this like Gothic haunted sort of section, I'm going to jump into books that are a little bit Gothic haunted adjacent. And so the first one that I would say is like under this section, but not directly haunted or directly Gothic, would be her archived series. And this is the first book in the series. And so this is about a library of the dead. The story is more of an adventure where a young girl who is the keeper of these histories, is trying to figure out why they're waking up more and what's going on as she returns them back to the library. And so it's more of an adventure story, and it suits under the haunted Gothic overarching theme simply because there are dead people that are sort of ghosts, but like in a book sense, which is why they're called histories. Very interesting. It's kind of hard to explain just because it's so original. And part of the reason I wanted to make these overarching themes instead of like direct recommendations based off of books you've liked before is because her books are so unique to me. They're not directly related. If you are looking for something that has to do with that like Gothic haunted theme, but maybe a little more adventure, maybe a little more of, like I said, an offhanded relationship to it, I would recommend looking into the archived series. I believe this is a 2-book series. They're super easy to get through and very, very good. These are some of her earlier works too, which is really cool. So I would go ahead and say to jump into the archived if you're looking for something kind of Gothic haunted adjacent. The last book under this section is going to be The Near Witch. And The Near Witch was actually V.E. Schwab's debut novel, and it is about a small village in which they are being haunted by the Near Witch, who is the kind of a legend, and she comes back and they believe it's her because the children are being drawn out of the beds in the middle of the night. And the mystery is what's happening to these children, and the main character has to go and find them. It's a very spooky, very atmospheric, again, very small, I believe, because it's a debut novel. It's not anything that's going to be crazy in depth, but a great place to start if you just want to like get a feel for her history. This was so V.E. Schwab in the sense that it is so enchanting. Next, we are going to go ahead and jump into the anti-hero, the villainous, the morally gray sort of books. So if you're interested in that type of a story, stay tuned for the next one. Oh, I'm linking all of these down below in the timeline as well. So if you are only interested in one specific theme out of all of these, find them down below. To jump into this section, we are going to start with probably the most obvious. I literally said villains in the section title, but the villain series. And the first book in that is Vicious. The second one is Vengeful. And the third one that is coming out in October is Victorious. The first thing that comes to mind is like comic book style. So the action in them is very comic book style. The superpowers are very comic book style. And this is about two MCs who are not in it for the greater good. They are in it for themselves. And so they kind of put themselves through these specific experiments in order to gain supernatural abilities, superpowers. It's kind of a fight between the two of them who can outlast the other, we'll say. And the whole story is very much nobody in it is in it for the greater good. The second one included. Everyone has their own agenda. And yet, you still end up rooting for specific characters, which is just crazy. And how V.E. Schwab tends to write her characters, and she says it a lot on social media, is that she will spend the first 100 pages just getting you connected to who her character is. And you can tell in these stories under this umbrella specifically, because they're all just not the greatest people. And yet you spend 2-3 books, multiple hundreds of pages getting invested in their story and like really caring about them. And so if you are interested in a story that has anti-heroes, villains at the heart, this would be the very first series that I would recommend. I thought it was really, really well written, especially as a story where, number one, it's very comic book style, but written word, which is just like, takes talent to write a comic action scene, but have no actual images. And on top of that, to have these characters who are naturally evil and you still root for them. I thought that was really, really cool. So I would recommend that one for anyone looking for an umbrella term of morally gray anti-hero type of stories. I would also recommend, under this umbrella of like morally gray evil type of characters, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, which just recently came out last year, and she marketed this book as literally toxic lesbian vampires. And so you can tell at the beginning there are barely any, if any, redeeming qualities about these vampires, and yet you spend a chunk of time learning about them and their story, and you still develop this feeling for them. So this is about 3 vampires, power, it's about rage, and it's about love. But not love in the romantic sense, love in the toxic romantic sense. And it is their story. It covers hundreds of years. It's kind of how these 3 women play into each other's lives and how they affect each other. This is one of those like internal type of stories where you really kind of are very introspective, I feel like, through the whole thing, but still under that morally gray main character umbrella. I would say that this one is one to check out if you're looking for something a little more maturely written, in the sense that it's not comic book style. It is vampires within our world. Lastly, under this section, I would say falls This Savage Song and Our Dark Duet. And so these are sort of older books by her, the Monsters of Verity series. And you have your main character who is a human and whose dad kind of runs the town by employing monsters, basically. And then by having the humans pay him to keep them safe. And so he's kind of like that like mafia leader type of character. And she wants to be just like him. She wants to be that morally gray character. And then on the other hand, you have the actual monster who doesn't want to be like that. He has a human dad, and all he wants is to be human and to feel things the way that his family and his father feel things. But he's not the only monster, and they are at war. It's sort of about a threat on her life that brings them together and sends them on their journey separately to figure out who they want to be through this whole entire war and fight that they're going through, and why they want to be that. And also, you know, who are they on the inside compared to how they are seen on the outside. If you're looking for something that's a little more urban dystopia type of fantasy, that falls under this monsters and anti-heroes type of thing, because the main characters are morally gray and are trying to figure out like where they rest on that scale, I would say that this is a really good place to start. The development of the story is very different, again, from all of the other ones that we've talked about so far. It leans more YA than, say, Bury Our Bones, which is very much an adult novel. So keep that in mind when choosing. So to jump into our last section here, we are going to start talking about fantastical, fantasy, magic sort of books that she has out. I'm gonna just start out with like the given fantasy series that V. Schwab, I believe, is probably known for. This is the Illumicrate edition, so the cover and all that is not the same, but that would be A Darker Shade of Magic. If I put it this way, you can see it. This is a 3-book series with a separate series that she's developing that I will also talk about within the same world, but a few years later in different characters. So A Darker Shade of Magic is your traditional fantasy adventure novel. However, it has the V. Schwab oomph to it where it's incomparable to other fantasy novels. So there's a magic system in which people called Antari can travel between 4 different Londons. And the way that V. Schwab explained it was, if you were to take 4 sheets of paper, one on top of the other, those are your 4 Londons. And to travel between them, you need Antari blood. And so the story follows an Antari from the 3rd London and the 2nd London. The 4th London is dead and gone. The 3rd London had shut the doors. There was something that started to take over the 4th London, and they decided that the best thing to do was to just close off all travel between them. For whatever reason, I can't remember now because it's been a little while, but the 3rd London and the 2nd one, White London and Red London, do travel between each other to keep the political information traveling. However, Grey London, the 1st London, has no magic left. So I might not be explaining this the greatest, but the thing that started to take over the 4th London is back in play, and it is traveling again. And so this is an adventure story, an adventure fantasy story about parallel Londons and the characters within them. This is a 3-book series, and I would say that if you are interested in more of your traditional fantasy, go ahead and read more into these. My explanation might not have been it, because it has been a little while since I've read them, and it's very much I feel like a harder thing to explain without giving away a whole bunch of details. But her world setup in this series is incredibly unique, and the characters are super well developed. The conflict is very unique. Everything about this series, although I say traditional fantasy series, everything is very unique. But if you are somebody who enjoys that like traditional fantasy story, I would suggest looking into the Darker Shade of Magic series. After you read A Darker Shade of Magic, jump into the Fragile Threads of Power. And this is the first book in another 3-book series that is set within the same world as Darker Shade of Magic series. It follows Tess, who can actually see the threads of power within the people who have magic, within magical objects, all of that sort of thing. And she goes on her own adventure to save the world. And so that is kind of a jump-off series that takes place a couple of years after the events that happen in A Darker Shade of Magic series. This is the only book out so far in this series, but I know she's working on it. Lastly, in this section of books that relate to the fantastical, fantasy, magic sort of system style of writing, I would say that my favorite book falls under this, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This book is, again, it's sort of like Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, where it's not directly fantastical and magical in the sense that, like, this is a fantasy adventure series, but it's set in our world if there were magic. It's more introspective. This one is about Addie LaRue, who was born in France hundreds of years before in a very small town, and she's getting forced into a marriage that she doesn't want to be in. She wants to travel, she wants to experience the world, and so on her wedding day, she runs away from the altar and she prays as the sun goes down, and her prayers are answered by one of the gods that answer after dark, and he does not have her best interests at heart, and he takes her prayer for freedom and turns it into nobody remembering who she is for the rest of her life. And also, your life is as long as you want it to be. As soon as you ask me to end it, I will. But until that point, nobody remembers who you are. And so she lives and she suffers and she experiences life for hundreds of years. And then one day, somebody does remember her. And that is more in today's day in New York. And so it kind of lifts her spirits a bit, because she had gotten to this point of like, what does it mean to live if you're not leaving a mark on anything? And the only marks that she learned to leave were impressions. This story I put under fantastical and magical, not because it's necessarily directly magic, like elemental magic or anything like that, but because it has a sense of magic. It has gods that deliver on prayers. It has immortal life, you know, and it has the ability to leave an impression even if nobody remembers who you are. And to me, that's pretty magical. But again, this book and Bury Our Bones, although one is monsters and one is magic, both sit in the fourth, like, undescribed section of more of an introspective type of story, less of a directly fantasy, directly adventure type of story, and more of a let's think about it. She also has a bunch of graphic novels that I haven't actually read, and they are related to the Darker Shade of Magic series and the Vicious series. I've seen some really good things about them. They look like great graphic novels, and I would love to jump into them, but I just want to go ahead and throw that out there too. If you are someone who has read the Darker Shade of Magic series or the Vicious series and you want more, she has graphic novels for them, so that might be something that you're interested in. That is V.E. Schwab's kind of backlist of titles, and I hope that this has been a guide that helps you decide maybe at least a section to start with, so you're not having to research 20 different books, and you can kind of decide for yourself, I'm more interested in ghost stories, I'm more interested in a morally gray MC or a monster MC, or I'm more interested in something that's just like fantasy, because she has things in each, and each book of hers is so unique that like you have to have a starting point. V.E. Schwab herself did a guide, and I will list her website down below, because who better to refer back to other than a reader than the author herself. And so she has her own guide. It's actually not all inclusive. She doesn't have the Near Witch on there, and I'm not sure if she has the Monsters of Verity on there either, but it could be another really good place to refer back to when deciding your first read from her. She lists kind of like where to go from those books too, if you have already started and maybe don't know where to go next. So yeah, I will list her website down below, because I do think that's a really good resource. And otherwise, I hope this has been helpful. V.E. Schwab is one of my favorite authors. I read stories for good stories, and V.E. Schwab writes really good stories. They're unique, they're in depth, they're well developed. You could tell she just cares about all of her characters and all of the worlds that she builds. Last thing I'm going to say is I am hoping to make this into a series. So my next author that I would love to do this sort of in-depth analysis of back titles for is Riley Sager. He falls under this same vein where all of his books are different. Every book is going to speak to a different reader. And so I would love to jump into his stories next. If you have any other recommendations for authors who have a long backlist that maybe not every book is going to speak to every reader, please drop it down below, because I think this type of video is really fun to do. And it brings me back to stories that I read a long time ago. On that note, I will see you guys next week. Bye.